At Riseigakuen High School, the day began before dawn, barefoot footsteps pounding against concrete, breath steaming in the cold as students sprinted into formation. Sleep was rationed to 4 hours. Laughter was forbidden. Food came once a day. This wasn't education, it was control. Absolute, suffocating, and meticulously enforced. Behind locked gates, teenage boys marched, scrubbed, and obeyed, cut off from the outside world, knowing escape meant punishment, not just for them, but for everyone around them. This case is about a real high school in Tokyo that operated more like a locked-down military camp than an educational institution. Riseigakuen High School, founded by Aotachi Oshiga, wasn't built to prepare students for college or nurture curiosity. It was designed to break them. From the outside, it looked like any other campus. Simple buildings, a modest yard, gates that could belong to 1,000 other Japanese schools. But step inside, and you'd enter a world governed by iron discipline, brutal hierarchy, and complete control over every minute of a student's life. Students were stripped of basic comforts. Their sleep was limited to 4 hours, midnight to 4 a.m., with no room for rest or recreation. Entertainment was banned. Contact with the outside world was cut off entirely. Even during permitted family visits, no external objects could be passed through. Every morning, students woke in silence, formed lines, and trained. The air was sharp with the scent of sweat and disinfectant. The floor slick from constant scrubbing. Their bodies ached not from sports, but from endless cleaning and drills treated like punishment. The institution's guiding philosophy was discipline through deprivation. Meals were reduced to bread and a single serving of milk. There were no clubs, no conversations after lights out, only silence, cold steel routine, and the looming presence of older students given unchecked authority. First years were labeled slaves, second years peasants, and third years lords. This wasn't metaphor, it was literal. This caste system ran the school. Abuse wasn't hidden, it was normalized. Riseigakuen didn't chase academic excellence. It wasn't about grades or tests. Few students went on to university. Instead, it churned out young men who had endured something few outside those walls could understand. And for decades, no one stopped it. No government crackdown, no major media expose. The pain stayed hidden behind locked doors until whispers and testimonies from former students started leaking out. And once you hear what really happened inside, it's impossible to forget. Inside Riseigakuen's gates, the line between education and endurance blurred quickly. The moment a student arrived, the atmosphere shifted. The school grounds were unnervingly clean, not in a polished, institutional way, but obsessively spotless. Every floor, hallway, and stairwell gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights. The smell of industrial cleaner lingered in the air, sharp enough to sting your nose. Silence ruled the corridors, broken only by barking commands and the rhythmic stomp of students sprinting in uniform, sweat-soaked and expressionless. Each day started before the sun. At precisely 4 a.m., students were jolted awake by shouting or the blast of a whistle. There was no time to gather thoughts, no time to breathe. Within minutes, they were outside, running, squatting, lining up for inspections. Morning routines weren't quiet or meditative. They were militant. No talking, no slouching, no hesitation. Eyes forward, backs straight. Every movement counted, and mistakes were punished, sometimes on the spot. And that was only the beginning. What followed wasn't school in any recognizable sense. There were classes, technically, lectures in math, science, literature. But even in those moments, tension hung thick in the air. Students sat rigidly, afraid to shift in their seats or lose focus. Outside of lessons, most of their time was consumed with physical labor. Rigorous cleaning drills, enforced farming sessions, group exercises meant less to educate than to exhaust. Everything had a purpose, and that purpose was control. The psychological weight was crushing. Meals were sparse. One bread roll and a carton of milk once a day. No snacks, no warm food, no second servings. Hunger gnawed at their concentration. Rumbling stomachs became part of daily life, as expected as uniform checks or morning drills. There were no phones, no TV, no books for pleasure, music, games, laughter. Any outlet for self-expression was stripped away. Time moved differently inside those walls. Days bled together. The seasons outside reduced to shadows, glimpsed through windows students weren't allowed to open. And then there was the hierarchy. In Riseigakuen, your grade level didn't just mark your academic standing, it defined your status in a rigid, dehumanizing caste system. First-year students were called slaves. That was the word used by staff and students alike. They cleaned the dorms, served meals, obeyed without question. Second years became peasants, gaining marginal freedom but still beneath authority. Third years, the lords, ruled without challenge. They weren't just seniors, they were enforcers, often turning their power into cruelty. Physical abuse wasn't hidden, it wasn't subtle, it was systematic. Seniors hit, pushed, berated underclassmen while staff looked the other way, or sometimes approved it. A missed chore or a misstep in formation could lead to push-ups until collapse, forced silence for hours, or worse. Humiliation was routine. Some students were made to squat in stress positions until their legs gave out. Others were assigned to stand frozen while their classmates passed by, pretending not to notice. Attempts to rebel, rare as they were, ended badly. Students who tried to escape the school grounds weren't just punished themselves. The entire dormitory would suffer. Collective punishment ensured silence. If one boy ran, the rest would pay. On at least one occasion, those left behind were forced into stress positions all day. Imagine holding a squat on bare tile floors for hours, muscles shaking, breath shallow, knowing that collapsing would only bring more discipline. For the ones who did get caught after running, things got worse. Public discipline, isolation, increased surveillance. Their names were rarely mentioned again. It was as if they had been erased, folded back into the system until no trace of their resistance remained. Fear was the currency of survival. Still, the school wasn't entirely isolated from the outside world. Family visits were allowed, but tightly controlled. No letters, no packages, no unsupervised contact. Conversations were monitored. Parents weren't shown much. A clean hallway, a polite guide, a few carefully selected students in pressed uniforms. It was enough to keep most questions quiet, enough to preserve the illusion. Despite the brutality, the school claimed it was building resilience, discipline, character. But the truth showed in the students' faces. Pale, hollow-eyed, emotionally flat. They were kids locked into a system that treated suffering as a rite of passage, and no one was watching closely enough to stop it. The worst part? Academic success wasn't even the goal. Riseigakuen didn't pride itself on university admissions. The curriculum wasn't designed to compete with elite prep schools. Very few graduates went on to higher education. The school's mission, if it had one, seemed focused on creating submission, obedient young men hardened by deprivation. Over time, as stories began to surface from alumni, most quietly, some anonymously, the pieces of the truth began to come together. Online forums filled with testimony, whispers about what really happened inside those walls, former students recalling sleepless nights, the stink of sweat in cramped dorms, the echo of fists slamming into lockers during punishment sessions. But by then, the damage was done. Riseigakuen had already left its mark on an entire generation of boys, some of whom never spoke of what happened to them again. And for decades, this place was real, hidden in plain sight. A school that wore its discipline like a badge, even as it dismantled the lives of the children it claimed to shape. It was the hierarchy that finally shattered them. Not in one explosive moment, but through a steady storm of sanctioned cruelty. Among everything that defined life inside Riseigakuen High School, there was one ritual that exposed the full depth of its brutality. The school's deliberate division of students into a rigid social structure, enforced by violence and fear. First-year students weren't just treated like newcomers. They were called slaves. Second years were peasants. Third years, lords. These weren't slang terms. They were institutional labels used by staff, students, and administrators alike. And those labels came with rules. Slaves obeyed everyone. Peasants obeyed the lords. Lords answered to no one. This wasn't an exaggeration. It was policy. First years cleaned the dorms, toilets, and hallways, usually on their hands and knees. They weren't allowed to walk alongside upperclassmen. They had to bow, speak in formal tone, and avoid eye contact. Any sign of resistance, missing a spot while scrubbing, reacting too slowly to a command, could be met with physical punishment, a slap, a kick, a shove into a wall. The older students delivered the blows. The teachers rarely interfered. Some even watched. But the most chilling part was the silence. Not just during the punishments, but in the way every student seemed to understand that speaking out would only make things worse. No one screamed. No one cried out. Pain was endured quietly, as if emotion itself was forbidden. Tension built with every day that passed, but it reached its peak when a group of first-year students made a desperate move. They tried to escape. It wasn't a sudden outburst. It was planned. Weeks of whispered conversations, watching schedules, timing routines, rationing the small bits of food they were given. On a cold early morning, while most of the dorm was still sleeping, they made a run for the outer fence. The timing was perfect. The guards were changing shifts. The gates were momentarily unmonitored, but they didn't get far. They were found a few hours later, huddled near a road miles from the school, exhausted, hungry, bruised from scaling fences and sprinting through forests. When they were dragged back inside, the consequences didn't fall just on them. They fell on everyone. That same afternoon, the entire group of first years was ordered into the main assembly hall. The floors were polished concrete. The air was dry and still. One by one, they were made to kneel in perfect rows, sitting in a traditional upright posture that, over time, becomes pure torment. Knees pressed to the ground, back straight, hands resting flat. No movement, no speech. Hours passed, no food, no water, just silence, except for the sound of footsteps pacing behind them. Third-year students with sticks or belts, occasionally delivering strikes to those who shifted or faltered. The windows were open, but no one dared to glance outside. The cold of the floor seeped into their bones. Sweat dripped down their backs. Legs began to go numb. Some fainted, some vomited. All were forced to continue. One former student would later recall how it felt like time stopped. Every second stretched into a lifetime. You could feel your own body breaking down, but your mind was too afraid to let go. They weren't punishing the escapees. They were sending a message. Trying to escape wouldn't just destroy you. It would destroy everyone around you. And it worked. For weeks afterward, students barely spoke to one another. The drills became more intense. Food portions were smaller. Free time, already non-existent, was replaced with additional cleaning shifts. A suffocating sense of paranoia set in. Every movement was watched. Every breath felt too loud. What made it worse was how easily the school concealed everything. Parents who visited were met with polished floors, carefully rehearsed smiles, and rehearsed greetings. The administration guided them through clean classrooms, well-dressed students, and scripted explanations about discipline and personal growth. The punishment hall was never shown. The bruises were hidden beneath sleeves, the fear tucked behind expressionless faces. And for a long time, no one outside ever knew. When Riseigakuen finally changed, it didn't come with protests or headlines. There was no televised reckoning, no sweeping reform. The brutal system that had defined the school for decades simply began to fade, quietly, almost politely, under pressure from low academic scores and whispers of abuse that grew too persistent to ignore. By the 1990s, the institution rebranded itself into an ordinary private high school. The building stayed, the name remained, but the past was quietly folded into silence. There were no public apologies, no formal investigations, no lists of victims, because there were no official records, just students, now adults, who carried memories too heavy to share out loud. Some left anonymous posts on obscure forums, describing the pain in their knees from kneeling too long, the smell of cold sweat in unheated dorms, the sound of footsteps in the dark, and the dread that came with every creak of the floorboards after lights out. Others said nothing at all. The emotional residue never left. It lingered in the way survivors described their lives afterward, not in outbursts, but in fragments. A nervous twitch when someone raised their voice, a lifelong fear of enclosed spaces, difficulty sleeping through the night. Not one of them spoke of school with nostalgia, only absence, only a space where something had been taken from them, something they couldn't name. And for the rest of Japan, Riseigakuen became a memory best left untouched. A cautionary tale, if acknowledged at all. A closed chapter, but for the ones who lived it, there was no closing, no justice, just the knowledge that no one came for them, no one asked, and long after the gates were unlocked, most of them never looked back, because even years later, some doors stay shut inside the mind. No official list was ever released naming the students who tried to escape. The school never acknowledged how many disappeared over the years, or what happened to those who were caught and punished in silence. Former students speak of certain dorm rooms that were abruptly emptied, beds stripped overnight, belongings erased without a trace. The government never launched an inquiry, no teachers were held accountable, and the caste system, slave, peasant, lord, was never documented in any public curriculum. It existed only in lived memory, passed down in fragments by those willing to remember what most have chosen to forget.